Lord Jesus, thanks for Sean. Thanks for his willingness to come and spend a day with us, equipping us. Thanks for his ministry. Thanks for his heart. And Lord, just thank you for what you're going to do through his words today to impact us and to, Lord, not only challenge us, but just change us and lead us into a deeper relationship with you, as well as equip us to stand firm in our faith in a culture that challenges us so often. So thanks for him today. Bless him, encourage him. Open our hearts in Jesus' name. Amen. Why don't you give Sean McDowell a warm welcome?
Well, thank you and good morning. It's a joy to finally be back in your beautiful country. My goodness, for 15 years, I probably had a chance to visit once or twice a year, but it's been 3 years because of, I don't know if you got the memo, but we're just getting through this pandemic. Finally back, but the cool thing is I came in Thursday night. My sister lives in Kamloops. They just moved there. We got a couple fans. And came in early, visited her, dropped off my son because he has 3 cousins, brought back with me my nephew. Beckett, stand up and wave and say hi. He's amazing, 13 years old. Loves soccer, almost 13. Loves soccer, football, so if you want to chat with somebody, he will love to chat about that. But I do have one observation before we start. We get a bad rap for how we drive in Southern California. But driving over that pass in the snow, and people passing me going 120 kilometers an hour while it's snowing in the fog, we've got nothing on some of you nice folks here in BC. But I made it and I survived, and we're gonna have a lot of fun today. Live your truth. That may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Be true to yourself. You ever heard somebody say that? There's a lot of confusion about truth today, isn't there? So since we're talking about 1 Peter 3:15, which is being ready with an answer to what we believe is true, figured I'd start with a verse that you all know from John 14:6, where Jesus said, I'm one of the ways, one of the truths, and one possible life. If you live according to what feels good, you're okay in my book. Jesus didn't say that, did he? Do you know there's at least 100 verses in the New Testament that directly or indirectly makes the claim that Jesus is the only way to get to God? Jesus seemed to think that truth and what we believe about it is pretty important. So have you ever just kind of stopped and reflected yourself for a moment? Why does truth matter? Like, who cares? Why bother? I was speaking on truth to a group of high school students. When I was done, this student came up to me afterwards. He said, Dr. McDowell, you just talked about truth for an hour. Why is truth even important? I said, well, do you want the true answer or the false answer? Now, when you ask why is truth important, even if you don't realize it, what are you already assuming is important? Truth. See, we know truth is important. We know truth exists. But we live in a world full of so much lies, so much confusion, that just bringing clarity on what truth is and why it matters has a lot of power in our cultural moment. Paul sure seemed to think truth is important. In 2 Thessalonians 2:10, it says, and with all deception of wickedness, for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of truth so as to be saved. Now, if I asked you if you love truth, and how many of you love truth, you would all raise your hands and say amen and say yes. That's our natural instinct, isn't it? But what about when truth costs you something? What about when truth hurts? What about when it's uncomfortable? Then are we willing to follow truth? That's at the heart of a question that we're asking today. So why is truth important? Let's start there. Why is truth important? Why does it even matter? Well, for one reason, truth has consequences. Truth has consequences. My uncle is a pastor in Massachusetts, and he told me a story about a distant cousin of mine that I never had a chance to meet. And this cousin of mine was deaf, And he would go walking on the train tracks out where they lived at the same time every morning. He got up one morning believing that he could walk and be safe like the morning before, but it never occurred to him that they would change the times that the trains came. So he was walking, believing he was safe. Couldn't hear the warning. The train couldn't stop in time. It actually struck and killed my cousin, largely because he had false information. Friends, that might feel like a dramatic example, but have you ever just stopped and paused and realized how many decisions, moment by moment, we make based on what we think is true? And when we're wrong, there's consequences. So you wake up and say, what day is that conference? Where is that conference? When does it start? And moment by moment, we make choices based on what we think is true. And when we get it wrong, there's consequences. That's why Hosea the minor prophet said, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. If you don't have truth about your health, you're going to wreck your health. If you don't have a marriage built on truth, you're going to wreck your marriage. If your country or my country doesn't love and value truth, at some point it's going to cost us something. So why does truth matter? Because lies and falsehood has consequences. But second, I'm going to ask all of you right where you're at to point the direction. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. With your eyes closed, point the direction you think is north. You got to choose. Keep your eyes closed. Point the direction. Now open up and look around and keep your eyes pointed. Now there's probably a majority pointing this direction. Now I can tell you it's not straight up. I kid you not. I believe every single time I've done this, somebody points straight up. Now, if you're trying to go north and you're confused, you're going to end up going in the wrong direction and end up somewhere in my country, right? Now, what might you have to help you know what direction north is? A compass or the app on your smartphone, right? You see, truth is a compass for life. When we know what direction north is and we have that true information, then we know how we should orient our lives and what direction we should go. That's the power of truth. Now, what's interesting to me is the first thing we learn about God in the Bible is what? In the beginning, God created. We learn that God is a creator because if something is made, there's truth about it and a way it's supposed to operate. So years ago, my mom, his Grammy, got a new computer system, and she was setting up an email account herself. And one of the first instructions said, close all the windows. My mom, you know Grandma Dot, who's given me permission to share this, Beckett, just for the record, is a very literal person. She got up, walked around the house, and closed all the physical windows in the house. Now you're chuckling because you know there's something true about a computer, don't you? It's designed to function a certain way. And when it says close all the windows, it doesn't mean the physical windows in your house. It's something we call a window on a computer screen, right? You see, there's a truth about a computer, and when we miss it, what happens? Confusion, frustration, loss, many times anger. But when we know the truth, what happens? Then we're free to use something in the way in which it's designed to operate. That's in part why Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Lies bring slavery. Truth brings freedom. Jesus is the truth. Satan is the father of what? Lies, the father of lies. Now, in the next talk, we're going to unpack this more and come back to this. But for now, it's important to realize that truth has consequences. But second, when we know truth, it tells us how we should orient our lives, what direction we should go, and how, in fact, we should live our lives. But the third reason truth matters is because believing is not enough. Believing is not enough. You might be thinking, what are you talking about? Look, nothing is true because you believe it. Nothing is true because you believe it. Do you know how many times I believed I was 6'10" and in the NBA? Yeah, I'm only 6'8". On this stage, at best. Now, it doesn't matter how much I believe that, right? Nothing's true because you believe it. I believe there's $1 million in my wallet up there. It doesn't matter how much I believe it. My great state of California would take most of it from me anyways, even if it were true. Friends, you can have your own beliefs, but you cannot have your own truth. You can have your own beliefs, but you cannot have your own truth. That's why it makes no sense to say live your truth. It makes sense to say live your beliefs, but it makes no sense to say live your truth. Now, we've been talking about why truth is important. One reason is truth has consequences. Number two, truth is like a compass for life. But number three, it's because believing is not enough. Nothing's true because we believe it. What we haven't done is define truth. So I'm going to give you a simple definition that I think will bring some clarity when we reflect upon it. And this is something philosophers call the correspondence theory of truth. In other words, a statement is true if it corresponds or matches up with reality. So if you have an idea or you have a belief and it describes the world as it actually is, then your belief is what? True. If it doesn't, your belief is false. That's it. So if I told you that I drove here from Southern California and it only took me 8 hours because I drove in my new red Lamborghini, and you go walk into the parking lot outside and you see this, my statement just might be what? Might be true, right? Just humor me. Now, if you walk outside and you see this, my statement would be what? False. Why? Because it's yellow and I described it as red. If you walk outside and see the kind of car that I actually drive, which is this, why are you laughing? I used this example with a 8th grade student. He goes, ha ha, you drive a Ford. I was like, what do you drive? But my statement would be really false because it's not even close. I actually teach my kids this kind of thing. Think about when it comes to truth, you have the word or idea, you have the object, and then you have the correspondence relationship. So in this case, you have 3 superheroes and you have the words. So that is Wolverine, that is Batman, and that is Spider-Man. Since that matches up, it's true. Is that smoke? No, I'm just kidding. I can't do this in California, by the way. What did you turn when I said that? What did you do? You turned and you looked, right? Since there's no smoke, don't worry, Sean, my statement was what? It was false. If there were, my statement would be true. This is how truth works, doesn't it? You have an idea, you make a statement, and then we see if the world is the way we described it to be. Now, the Bible doesn't define truth this way. You can't turn to Nehemiah chapter 4 and it says, here's the definition of truth. But the Bible assumes this view of truth, doesn't it? What's the 9th commandment? Thou shalt not lie. What's a lie? A lie is not something that's false. It's an intentional misrepresentation of the truth. So you can't have a lie without truth. Now, we know everybody might not be able to define truth this way if they haven't thought about it. Everybody uses truth in this fashion. It's inescapable. But when the topic shifts to moral values or religion, many people will shift what they even mean by truth, which is why people say, live your truth. So let's break this down a little bit. I'm curious. What would you say is the best flavor of ice cream? If I was going to take my nephew out and get some great Chilliwack ice cream, what would be the best flavor? Vanilla, strawberry, and chocolate. That sounds really creative. I did not come from California all the way. I'm kidding. What other flavors? Seriously, what's the best flavor of ice cream? I heard cookie dough, Rocky Road, sherbet. Sorry, that's not an ice cream. Pistachio. Okay, all right. These are good flavors, but I have not heard the best flavor of ice cream. The best flavor of ice cream is chocolate peanut butter. Now, I'm really curious. How many of you'd say that statement is true? Let me see your hands. How many of you'd say that statement is false? Okay, we find ourselves in a very strange dilemma. You're telling me the statement chocolate peanut butter ice cream can be true for me, but not true for many of you? And the answer is because we're talking about something we call subjective. Subjective claims are personal, and they're private, and they can change. Think about, what's the key word within subjective? Subject, exactly. The individual or the person or the subject that believes something, you could almost say makes it true for him or her because it's the kind of claim that depends upon what the subject thinks or feels or experiences. They are internal claims that depend upon the individual. When you think of subjective claims, I want you to think of chocolate peanut butter ice cream or just ice cream because ice cream flavor preference, whether it's chocolate, vanilla, pistachio, mint chip, or chocolate peanut butter, is a subjective claim. All right, now what if I said chocolate peanut butter ice cream controls diabetes? Usually I get an amen. There's clearly no Baptists here. Now, you kind of chuckled because that's a very different kind of claim, isn't it? This is not a preference claim about the subject. This is an objective claim about the world in itself, that if you get it wrong, has consequences, right? So instead of a subjective claim, this is what we call an objective claim. So objective claims are about the external, mind-independent world, independent what a person or subject believes about it. So subjective claims depend upon the subject. Objective claims depend upon the object. Yeah, good. So for example, if I said I have a big scoop of chocolate peanut butter ice cream and I said, this is delicious. Is that really about the ice cream or is it about my experience of the ice cream? It's about my experience of it. It's a matter of taste. But if I said this is 25 grams, what's that about? That's the object, the ice cream itself, not my experience of it. So when you think of objective claims, we're going to think of insulin. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to put some statements up on the screen, and I'm going to ask you to participate here with me by shouting out one of two things. If it's a subjective claim, shout out ice cream. If it's an objective claim, shout out insulin. Now, one qualifier before we start. I'm not asking if these claims are true or false. I'm simply asking what kind of claim are they. If they're subjective, ice cream. If they're objective, all right, you got this. Here we go. Coke tastes better than Pepsi. It's going to be a long day. There's always one, right? Got my eye on you, buddy. Now, we all know it's ice cream, right? Even if you're like, I don't like Coke or Pepsi, we know it's a preference type claim. Okay, good. How about this one? Diet Coke has fewer calories than regular Coke. Okay, insulin, because now we're talking about the soda itself and a property it allegedly has. Okay? 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, good. I don't think I've had a single person shout out ice cream for this one, although they're trying really hard in my country to change this. But we all know math deals with a mind-independent reality. We know that. Good. Ice cream or insulin? Hawaii is the most beautiful vacation spot on earth. Ice cream, okay, good. We all know it's Southern California. Actually, by the way, if I put the claim up there, a rose is beautiful, that's objective. If you don't think a rose is beautiful, you are just as mistaken as if you think 2 + 2 = 5. And I am dead serious. But I digress. Ice cream or insulin, example from my country. George Washington was the first president of the United States. Insulin, okay, good. All right, now you can't see that in the way you could see smoke allegedly in the back. It's in the past, but we still know there's a mind-independent truth about the way things were. So you're right, historical claims are like insulin. Action movies are more enjoyable than romances. Ice cream. Now, I know some of you want to say insulin, but fellas, I've been married 23 years. Do not die on that hill. Ice cream or insulin? Sean McDowell can bench press 300 pounds. Who says ice cream? Let me see your hands. Who says insulin? All right, now I want you to listen very carefully. Do you know the truth about that statement? No. Do you have to know the truth status of that statement to know whether it's a preference claim or whether it's an objective claim? The answer is you don't. See, don't confuse whether we know if something is true or false as to whether or not there is a truth status of a particular claim. So there is a truth about that claim, isn't there? There's an objective status. Either it's true or false, and your beliefs don't change that. This is not a subjective, mind-dependent claim. This is objective. In this case, it would be me. Now, we could test it, right? We could throw on some weights and cut off. Actually, I wouldn't cut this off. My wife bought me this for Valentine's Day, so I would not do that. But throw on some weight gloves and see if I could bench press it or not. There is a truth about that, even though you don't know what the answer is. So, for example, if I said there's 50 quadrillion, zillion atoms in the universe, that's a claim about the objective world. We will never be able to test that, but there's still a truth about that claim. So this claim is insulin. Now, some of you are like, yeah, but can you do it? Here's the deal. I cared before I turned 40. Now I just want to stay alive. All right, ice cream or insulin? Earth is the center of the solar system. Okay, it is insulin. You paused because why? Because it's false. You can have a false insulin claim. If I said 2 + 2 = 5, that's about a mind-independent reality, the world of math, but it's false. If I said George Washington was the second president of the United States, that would be an insulin claim, but it would be false. Now, this is not a historical claim. It's not a mathematical claim. What kind of claim is that? What kind of claim is this? It's a scientific claim. So far, you've told me mathematical claims, scientific claims, and historical claims are like insulin. I want everybody to vote on this one. Ice cream or insulin, abortion is wrong. Who says ice cream? Who says insulin? Who says after watching the American elections, I will never vote again? No, I'm kidding. Just partly kidding. Now, this is not a scientific claim, is it? Although science may bear on it, this is a moral claim. Are moral claims all matters of preference like ice cream flavor? Or are there objective, mind-independent moral truths? Now, a number of years ago, I was having a conversation with a fellow about this question. He goes, look, if you don't like abortion, don't have one. I said, sorry to point out the obvious, but I can't. By the way, I actually think Sarcasm is the sixth love language. My wife's not convinced, but I'm pretty sure 25 years she'll agree. Now, notice what he did. If you don't like abortion, as if the question of the morality of abortion is a matter of taste, preference. If you don't like chicken, get the fish. If you don't like coffee, get tea. If you don't like abortion, don't have one. So I asked him a question. I said, hey, are you against slavery? And he looked at me like I was stupid. I said, then if you don't like slavery, don't own a slave. Are we against slavery because we don't like it and don't prefer it? No, we actually think it's wrong to own another person in the way it's been practiced, in particular in the West, and mistreat somebody based on something secondary, such as skin color. Friends, if all morality were like ice cream, you couldn't judge anything as being objectively wrong. Racism, sexism, misogyny, genocide. You can say you don't prefer it, but it's not actually wrong. So the deal is, whenever somebody tells me they're a relativist, I never believe them. Why? Number one, Romans 2 says, even people without the law know the law because it's written where? On the human heart. My father said to me, he'd say, son, you know what someone believes about morality, not by what they say, not by what they do, but by how they want to be treated. People break a promise to you, but the moment you break a promise to them, they will cry foul. I tell my students, I teach at Biola University full-time, but I still teach one high school class 3 mornings a week, a Bible class at private school. And I'll tell my students things. I'll say, look, if someone tells you there's no such thing as right and wrong, cut in front of them in line. And very quickly, they will let you know that you have violated a very sacred moral law, and you should have known differently. Friends, we know there's right, and we know there's wrong. It's written on the human heart. We can't escape it. So it's probably been, 12 years now. When I was teaching high school full-time, 3 of my students came into me, and they said, Mr. McDowell, in the public school across town, like 1 or 2 miles away, they had this big free-thinking atheist event. And 100 students came out to hear about like agnosticism and the evidence that there is no God. And they were telling me about it. I was like, well, what do you guys want to do? And we came up with this idea that 3 of my students would challenge 3 of their students to a public debate on evolution and creation, the historical Jesus, and on morality. And this club accepted. So in our church, it's one of the coolest things I've ever done. It was packed, and our church seated like 400, but it was packed with people around the walls, and there was like energy in the room. And during one of the speeches, one of my students got up there and said, we all know there's such a thing as right and wrong, fairness and justice and truth-telling. That's because there's a moral law. The best explanation for a moral law is that there's a moral law giver. Morality points towards God. One of their students got up there and said, there is no objective morality. It's all a matter of preference. You live according to your beliefs. We live according to ours. Hence, morality is not evidence for God, and he sits down. But then when it was time for the closing speeches, the same student who, keep in mind, just said, there's no objective moral law, walked behind the podium and noticed that it was primarily a Christian audience, and he was behind a podium in a church, described himself as an agnostic, and he spent his closing speech railing against Christians for being bigoted, intolerant, homophobic, hateful. Shame on you, Christians. Do you notice an irony in this? There is no objective moral standard. It's all preference, but you hateful, bigoted, immoral Christians have violated every objective moral law, and you should have known differently. Now, I was moderating this, and I was so tempted to say, wait, time out. I'm confused. You're speaking out of both sides of your mouth. But if I had done so, he would have objected that such a thing is immoral as the moderator. So I chose not to. See, the reality is, can atheists know right from wrong? Of course. Can atheists be moral? Of course. I have some atheist friends who are kinder and more generous to me than many Christians. And that's a fact. But that's not the interesting question. The question is, can a naturalistic worldview in which there is no God ground objective right and wrong? And even this agnostic 17-year-old kid understood that his worldview implied there's no objective morality, but he couldn't live it out and his life betrayed him. By the way, if there's no objective moral law, what would that do to the gospel? There'd be no reason for Jesus to die. So before we move on, what is the question about abortion? Look, let me say real quickly before I answer this. I know even bringing this up is a sensitive, painful topic. And some of you, if you have experience in this, could carry some hurt and shame with this. I want you to know abortion is not the unforgivable sin. There's grace and mercy and love and freedom for you. Please, please know that. Amen? But don't you imagine after this conference, you go home and you decide to do the dishes. Okay, now for some of you, this is going to take a lot of imagination. And I would put my kids in that category. Your back is turned, you're doing the dishes, and maybe your younger kid or grandkid or sibling who's like 4 or 5 years old comes walking up and while you can't see says, "Hey, mommy, daddy, papa, can I kill this?" Before you say yes or no, what question would you ask? What is it? Right? If you turn around, it's a cockroach, you'd be like, "Hurry up." If you turn around, it's a little puppy, you'd be like, "Whoa, why would you ask that?" If you turn around, they're like, "Hey, I pulled this infant out of a carriage. Can I kill this?" You'd be like, "Whoa, no, definitely not." And even though you're 5, you need serious counseling. Now, why the difference in response to a cockroach and to an infant? And the answer is because what it is. How we treat something should depend upon what it is. Friends, either the unborn is human or it's not. Either we protect human life or we don't. It is not a matter of preference. That's a question of fact. The morality of abortion, wherever you happen to land on this, is not a matter of preference. It's ultimately a question of the objective world in which we live. Now, with that said, how about this one? Ice cream or insulin? Jesus was a carpenter. Insulin? Jesus died on the cross in AD 30. Yeah, some argue 29, some argue 33, but it's still an objective claim. How about this one? Jesus resurrected as proof he is divine. Insulin, good. Now, this is kind of a historical claim because we believe the resurrection happened roughly 2,000 years ago. But this is a religious, theological claim, isn't it? Are religions matters of preference that, hey, Buddha's true for you, but Jesus is true for me? Or do they deal with the objective, real world? So let's bring some clarity here. I hope nobody is confused about this. That if you don't die and go to hell just for not believing in Jesus. You realize that, right? You don't die and go to hell just for not believing in Jesus. People die and spend eternity separated from their Creator because of a rebellion against their Creator, because of a moral virus the Bible calls sin. And to say that Buddha or Krishna or Muhammad or any other religious figure can forgive my sins is like saying chocolate peanut butter ice cream controls diabetes. It doesn't work in the objective, real world. Have you ever really just stopped and thought, why is Jesus the only way? I mean, let's be honest. It feels a little bit intolerant, doesn't it? It feels a little bit narrow-minded and exclusive. One of the biggest virtues today is diversity understood in a certain way and inclusiveness. The idea that Jesus is the only way doesn't seem very diverse, and it doesn't seem very inclusive. You know why Jesus is the only way to God? Because Jesus is the only one that fixed the problem that separates us from God. The problem is sin. There is an objective moral law within God's very character. God is truth. God is holy. God is righteous. God is love. And sin separates us from God. Jesus is the only one who is the God-man who lived a sinless life and paid the debt that we owe to God, and offers us by grace through faith salvation if we're humble enough to accept it. So friends, look, think about it. If you're driving home after this and you run out of gas, it doesn't do any good to rotate your tires. Doesn't do any good to get new spark plugs or drop a few $1,000s to get a new transmission. You've got to identify the problem and fix it. The problem is sin. And Jesus is the only way because he's the only one who fixed the problem. That's why 1 Corinthians 15 says, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins. Do you realize how powerful this is? Paul writes this in AD 55, probably 20 to 25 years after the death of Jesus, roughly, when there were still people alive at this time. And he bases the entirety of the Christian message to a single, testable, historical event. That means if you were there with the women at the empty tomb, you could have actually seen this massive stone rolled away, ducked, entered into, smelled the scent of this musty tomb, and seen the linen cloth of Jesus laying there. If you're there with Thomas when he says, I will not believe unless I can see with my eyes and touch with my hands, you could have reached out and touched the spear wounds in the side of Jesus. If you're there at the cross, you could have reached out and touched the cross and felt the trickle of warm blood that had a certain blood type, and you could have even gotten a splinter on your hand from the cross. Friends, Christianity is not the kind of system that can be true for you, but not true for you. Either it's true or it's false. You believe it or you don't. Now, there's a few objections we're going to quickly walk through. And then after each session, we're going to open it up for questions. So if you're thinking of a question, number one, write it down so you don't forget it. Okay? I don't have to write stuff down. I have photographic memory. I just don't have any film. If you didn't get that, ask somebody over 30. We're going to throw a number up there, and I believe it's your personal cell phone. Sean, no, I'm kidding. He's like, whoa, time out. What's that? It's my cell phone. Thank you. So I'm available 24/7. Let me run that by my wife. If she says that's cool, I'd be happy to do it. We've got a number coming up there. You can text a question. So just think through making as quick and succinct and to the point if you want it to be read and likely answered. After each session, we're going to come back to that. Okay? But for now, here's some common objections you might hear. You might hear somebody say, well, there is no truth. If there is no truth, then clearly Jesus can't be the truth. Now, this commits a very obvious fallacy, and I think you should pick up on it. It's kind of like sawing off the very branch that you're sitting on. So here's a question. If somebody says there's no truth, ask them a simple question. Is that true? If they say yes, then say, okay, I think I understand it's true that there's no truth. If they say no, then say, if it's not true, then why'd you bother to say it? Now, I don't think I've ever directly had somebody say, there is no truth to my face, but I've had people say things like, you shouldn't force your morals on others. My question is that your morality? Yeah. Well, if you shouldn't force your morals on others, and that's your morality, then why are you forcing your morality upon me? Maybe you've heard somebody say, well, you shouldn't judge. My question is that your judgment? The answer is, if you say you shouldn't judge, you're making a moral judgment. You ever heard somebody say, you should be more open-minded to views different than your own? Okay, is my view different than yours? Yes. Then if you should be open to views different than your own, and my view is different than yours, why are you so close-minded to my view? Friends, we know there's such a thing as truth. The question is, what is true? How about this one? But sincerity is more important than truth. There's something inside of us when we look at people of other faiths and we think, gosh, they're so sincere. Who am I to judge? I understand that instinct. But even Paul talks about people with zeal who lack knowledge. The problem with this claim is people can be sincerely wrong. And ironically, you can be insincerely right. Sincerity has nothing to do with whether something is true or false. How about this one? Isn't it arrogant to think that you are right? Isn't it arrogant to think that you are right? Now, notice what happened here. Now we've shifted from the topic at hand to the alleged arrogance of the person who's asserting that they know truth. Do you see how the deflection has taken place? So let me ask you a question. Can you be arrogant and be right? Sure. Can you be arrogant and be wrong? Yeah. Can you be humble and be right? Can you be humble and be wrong? Yeah. What on earth does somebody's attitude have to do with whether objectively they're right or wrong? Now, is there a connection between humility and a likelihood of knowing truth? Absolutely. That's why the Bible says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But what happened here is the person is now attacking you rather than the topic. So I've had people say to me, gosh, that's really arrogant. You think you know the truth. And in my best moments, I'll say, you know what? If I've been arrogant, I apologize. Humility is a Christian virtue. But help me understand why my alleged arrogance has any relevance to whether or not my claim is true or false. By the way, sometimes people will make a claim like it's arrogant to know truth when they realize they've lost the argument, insult the person. And frankly, if we're honest, we've all done it, haven't we? How about this one? But it feels true to me. About 3 years ago in conversation with my dad, which is very interesting, he said, son, I think we're at the point in culture where now even feelings trump truth. This was actually probably 4 or 5 years ago, before a lot of the topics we're talking about today. And I think he's right. By the way, you see it in different ways on all sides of the political spectrum, don't you? Feelings now seem to trump truth. Now, I want to show you a video, and this is going to lead us into a conversation that we're going to have soon. This was in Washington State about probably 4 or 5 years ago when there were huge debates in my country, and I realize you have these discussions too about bathrooms and using preferred pronouns. And this friend of mine, Joseph Backholm, went to a college campus, and I want you to notice, all he does is ask questions. Listen how often people respond to a logical question, but I feel this and I feel that. Pay close attention, and then we'll unpack it. Here we go.
There's been a lot of talk about identity lately, but how far does it go? And is it possible to be wrong? We went to the University of Washington to find out.
Are you aware of the debate happening in Washington State around the ability to access bathrooms, locker rooms, spas based on gender identity and gender expression?
I think people should be able to have access to the facility.
I think bathrooms could and potentially should be gender neutral because there doesn't need to be a classification for differences.
I think people definitely should have the ability to go into whichever locker room they want.
I feel like at least public universities should do their best to accommodate for those who do not have a specific gender identity.
You know, whether you identify as male or female and whether your sex at birth is matching to that, you should be able to utilize the resources.
So if I told you that I was a woman, what would your response be?
Good for you. Okay. Like, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
I'll be like, what? Really?
I don't have a problem with it.
I'd ask you how you came to that conclusion.
If I told you that I was Chinese, what would your response be?
I mean, I might be a little surprised, but I would say, good for you. Like, yeah, be who you are.
I would maybe think you had some Chinese ancestor.
I would ask you how you similarly came to that conclusion and why you came to that conclusion.
I would have a lot of questions just because on the outside I would assume that you're a white man.
If I told you that I was 7 years old, what would your response be?
I wouldn't believe that immediately.
I probably wouldn't believe it, but I mean, it wouldn't really bother me that much to go out my way and tell you, no, you're wrong. I'd just be like, oh, okay, he wants to say he's 7 years old.
If you feel 7 at heart, then then so be it. Yeah, good for you.
So if I wanted to enroll in a first grade class, do you think I should be allowed to?
Probably not, I guess. I mean, unless you haven't completed first grade up to this point and for some reason need to do that now.
If that's where you feel like mentally you should be, then I feel like there are communities that would accept you for that.
I would say so long as you're not hindering society and you're not causing harm to other people, I feel like that should be an okay thing.
If I told you I'm 6 feet 5 inches, what would you say?
That I would question.
Why?
Because you're not. No, I don't think you're 6'5".
If you truly believed you're 6'5", I don't think it's harmful. I think it's fine if you believe that. It doesn't matter to me if you think you're taller than you are.
So you'd be willing to tell me I'm wrong?
I wouldn't tell you you're wrong.
No, but I say that I don't think that you are.
I feel like that's not my place as like another human to say someone is wrong or to draw lines or boundaries.
No, I mean, I wouldn't just go like, oh, you're wrong, like that's wrong to believe in it. Because I mean, again, it doesn't really bother me what you want to think about your height or anything.
So I can be a Chinese woman.
You sure.
But I can't be a 6'5" Chinese woman.
Yes.
If you thoroughly debated me or explained why you felt that you were 6'5", I feel like I would be very...
What on earth just happened? Notice what he did. He didn't make a single statement, did he? He just asked questions. By the way, Jesus told stories and he asked questions. There's power in asking questions. So he started by asking, what would you say if I'm a woman? And because of the cultural milieu that we live in, even though he's a man, there was this response by most, good to meet you, fine, awesome. Then he said, what if I'm Chinese? And there's a little bit of a hesitation. What if I was 7? A lot of hesitation. What if I was 6'5"? Nope, that's where we draw the line. At the heart of this is a common question. Does biology matter? Is there an objective truth embedded in my body that should inform and determine how we think? Now, you can't say feelings trump biological reality and turn around and say that he's not 7 and he's not 6'5". If feelings determine the facts, then he can be a 7-year-old, 6'5" Chinese woman. If the facts do matter, he's not 7, he's not 6'5", he's not Chinese, and he's not a woman. Friends, our feelings do not determine reality. Now, feelings are beautiful, they're wonderful. Sometimes apologists will play them down. I'm like, no, thank God for feelings. They play a valuable role in a healthy, functioning person. But feelings do not make something true. And if we live our life on our feelings, divorced from what is true, we're going to wreck our lives. The last one before we take questions is this: but all religions are true. Have you ever heard this one? A high percentage of non-Christians and increasingly Christians among Gen Z, it's somewhere around half, I think it's 47% if I remember correctly, would say, Jesus is my truth, but other paths lead to God. Friends, one way to look at this, I made a simple chart. I'll leave it up here. This might be helpful to you. On the left, I put 5 big religions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and their view of God, salvation, and other religions. Buddhists do not believe in a monotheistic God. Some versions of Buddhists have multiple gods. Some versions of Buddhism are more atheistic. Hindus believe in 330 million gods, or some would say one God, many forms. Jews would say one God, Yahweh, Muslims one God, Allah, and Christians one God who's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now let me ask you a question. Could all 5 of those be false? Sure. But they can't possibly all be true. Any more than I can have 1 head, 3 heads, no head, and many heads. Salvation is not by enlightenment, reincarnation, the law, or covenant, the 5 pillars in Islam, and by grace. They contradict one another at their core. In fact, even many Hindus I've had conversations with would say, oh, Christianity is true, Jesus is your truth. But what do they mean? They mean if you take Christianity and you put it within the system of Hinduism, then Christianity is true because it helps you advance within the system of Hinduism. But even any honest Hindu would say Christianity is false on its own terms. All religions could be false, but they can't possibly all be true. All religions could be false, but they can't possibly all be true. So how do we know Christianity is true? One way, I really believe when somebody opens up the scriptures with an open heart and with an open mind, the Holy Spirit can directly reveal the truth of who Jesus is and the power of the scriptures. I think that's one way people can know. We also can know by looking at the evidence itself. Did Jesus really exist? Did he claim to be God? Did he die by crucifixion? Did people actually see him alive? What does the archaeology show? What does the manuscript show? Can we trust the eyewitness testimony? Does science show there's a need for mind, or can everything be explained by matter in motion? We have not answered this question, and it's not the focus today. What we've talked about today is that there is such a thing as truth, and truth matters distinctly to Christianity. Now, how do we know it's true? Christianity invites an investigation of the evidence. Jesus says, use your mind. He shows to Thomas the spear wounds in his side and the nail marks in his hand. Jesus did not say, I'm one of the ways, one of the truths, and one possible life. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Let's jump ahead to the questions. I'll skip through that for right now. Sean, you want to come on up here, buddy, and join me? I'd love to have another Sean on stage, even if you misspell your name. You knew that was coming, right? It was only a question of which one of us was going to shoot first, so to speak. All right, so again, you can text your questions to that number, and I would just, for sake of time, instead of doing a mic, I asked if we could text in so we could just get as many questions and be as helpful as possible. So be distinct, to the point, and we will start to work through as many related to this. Now, to give you a framework while you're looking at those, the next talk, we're going to talk about kind of a biblical view of sexuality rooted in this. Where do we start on God's design for sexuality? Then after lunch, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. We're going to talk about transgender ideology and really the elephant in the room, which is pornography. And after each of these sessions, we'll take questions.
All right, scene. Here's the first question.
Touche.
Okay. This one asks, why is there so much attack on objective truth, insulin, in our world today? Has there been this much attack on truth in history? How do we overcome it? Or how did we overcome it?
By the way, really quickly, I was on a plane a couple years ago, and I introduced myself. I said, yeah, I'm Sean McDowell. And this guy goes, no, you're not. I said, I'm pretty sure that I am. With a Scottish accent, he goes, it's McDowell. I was like, oh, I guess you win this one. Why is there so much attack on objective truth? I would say probably two things. Number one, a lot of it is just flat out confusion. There's a whole lot of people, Christians and non-Christians, who haven't really thought through what is truth? How do we discover it? Why is it important? So a huge chunk of this is confusion. But second, if there is such a thing as truth outside of me, that means I'm not my own God. I don't get to create reality. My job is to discover reality and submit to that reality. So in a sense, as you go back to the garden, it's questioning, are we God of our own life? Or are we going to recognize an authority outside of ourselves? So if there's no objective truth embedded in the world, I can use my money how I want, my language how I want, my body how I want, because it's not meant or designed for a purpose. So whether people explicitly have that in mind or just kind of sense it, I think that's why there's so much undermining of truth. We have this sense that it's really a question of authority, isn't it? Is authority internal and subjective, or is authority external and objective? And this is one huge shift in culture. Some of you have asked me, you might recognize the last name McDowell and wonder, are you related to Josh? The answer is yes. Josh McDowell is my dad. If you don't recognize that name, he's spoken at 1,200 universities, 150 books, just been an amazingly faithful apologist for years. And he set out to disprove Christianity, was surprised by the evidence, and wrote a book in 1972 called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Now you participate. No, I'm kidding. Called Evidence Demands a Verdict. Do you know what was lacking in that book? Any need for chapters on truth. People knew there was such a thing as truth, and it was important. In the updated version we did in 2017, there's, I think, 3 chapters we put it in the back of the book. What is truth? How do we know truth? Why is truth important? That's a huge shift in culture, basically from objective to subjective. We've seen it take place. And part of my question is, how much further can we go down this rabbit hole, so to speak?
All right, for those who believe the truth of Christianity, how do feelings and emotions play into that?
So feelings and emotions are a gift from God. They're beautiful. In one sense, feelings and emotions alert us when something is good or when something is broken. So if I'm feeling anxious, sometimes I got to stop and reflect and say, what's going on in my life that I'm feeling anxious? Maybe I just need a Snickers bar. I mean, honestly, sometimes it's like, just get some food. Other times, maybe I'm stressed relationally or stressed financially. Feelings help us understand when certain things are broken. But God has also given us feelings, a beauty that we experience in worship, a beauty in, seeing a baby born, like there's beauty in that. The feeling of seeing a beautiful flower or snow that falls. Feelings are a gift from God to experience the world as embodied beings. And we better pay attention to our feelings. But one thing I know is because we're sinful beings, where sin has affected our body and our minds, our feelings can misguide us if we don't bring them back and always say what is true, what is right. That's a quick answer.
All right, single most effective argument to neutralize atheism. Just wanted to give you just an easy one.
So, I know you didn't ask it this way, and I asked you to state a quick question. But because I have so many friends who are atheists, and even some family members in my extended family who are not believers, I'm always sensitive to the language that feels like atheists and atheism are people that need to be neutralized and defeated and beat in an argument. Now, that might have not been the intention of this text at all, but it gives me a chance to pause and think. We've got to be careful about how we talk about and engage atheists. Now, as I'm going to talk about in my talk on transgender, we are in spiritual warfare. There's a battle of ideas, Paul says. And I'm telling you, I just did an interview 3 weeks ago with the leading psychiatrist in the world who consults on exorcists. Absolutely fascinating. It reminded me of Ephesians 6, that we do not fight against flesh and blood, but spiritualities and principles, etc. So we're in a spiritual warfare. We're in a battle of ideas. We are to speak truth, but not to win arguments, not to sound smart, not just to neutralize atheists, but to love atheists and to give them a chance to respond to the gospel, because it's that truth that will set them free. Now, with that said, it's interesting when people say, what's the most effective evangelism Jesus did? And I think how Jesus evangelized really varied based upon the person, didn't it? He was wise enough to know there's not just one strategy that always works. And I think the same is true with the evidence for God. It's a cumulative case. I think the beginning of the universe, and by the way, if you come next year, Frank Turk is going to unpack this. The beginning of the universe is best explained by a beginner. The fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by a fine-tuner. The origin of consciousness from dead matter is best explained by there being a conscious being that breathed this into existence. The origin of life, because it's full of information, is best explained by an information giver. The origin of Christianity is best explained by the resurrection. The moral law is best explained by a moral lawgiver. Now, which of these most appeals to somebody, in some ways depends upon how that person thinks. If that person is scientific-minded, that might be very different than somebody who's, an anthropologist or sociologist and is culturally minded. In fact, in a lot of cases, I don't always use evidence. There's some people that just need different care and approaches and just to hear the gospel directly. So if somebody said to me, Sean, you can only have one argument for the existence of God, either I'd use the evidence for the resurrection or probably the moral law. Because the moral law is not something we see with our minds, it's something we feel. So if forced, I would probably use that. But keep in mind, it's a cumulative general case. I sent out a tweet last week and I said, hey, atheists and agnostics, I have a question for you. Is there anything in the world that gives you pause and makes you think there might be a God? It was really interesting. Quite a few of them said nothing. You know what that tells me? You're not even open to hearing the evidence at all. There's nothing I could do to convince you. I mean, even Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away. Quite a few said beauty. Someone said fine-tuning. And a few said the moral law. So that's where I would go. But if I'm talking with an atheist, I want to find out what's their core root issue and scratch where they itch, so to speak.
You might have touched on that a little bit in that answer, but maybe go a little deeper with this. How can we deal with the push for diversity and inclusion in society that excludes room for the Christian view?
Whew, that's a big question. I've written an entire book on this. Let me just make a couple quick points. Number one, we have to make sure that we are actually living out the Christian ethic. If we're not really loving our neighbors, if we're not gracious, if we're not kind, then it's going to make the idea that Christians are intolerant sit so much easier in our culture. Now, that doesn't guarantee anything, but we got to look within first and say, are we just fighting a political battle? How do we talk about people of different races, religious backgrounds, whatever it might be? Are we living out that in our own lives? And do we have genuine biblical diversity within the church? Diversity is a biblical idea. God created diversity in creation. It's present in the church, and we'll see it in heaven. So we have a grounding for real diversity. So we've got to make sure we are living it out, approaching it with the right heart, but we also have to speak truth. There's a time when we have to call people. I've written blogs on this. I've spoken publicly at times and say, you claim to be open-minded, you claim to be tolerant, but you're not. You are actually more closed-minded than many conservative Christians, and I mean theologically, would be. So look within first, make sure we're living it out. Build relationships with people and actually love them. Get on the school board. Get involved in the community, not just to win some debate about a textbook, but to love people and to be present. But then at times, be willing to speak truth and not compromise. That's where at some point we have to say, here I stand, no more. That's a quick answer.
That's good. Time for one more question, and then we'll have a coffee break. And we'll try to get some of these other ones later as well, but this is probably pretty important for people to know from you, Sean. Which Spider-Man is the best?
That is so not fair. So I grew up loving superheroes, and when I was a kid, the only time I could see Spider-Man was like 2 minutes on the Electric Company once a week. I would wait until he would web down, read a book, and disappear. So when the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man came out, my wife, who I've really known since third grade, that's another story, is she looked at my face when it started and was like, I don't think I've ever seen so much joy in you. She said, you just looked like a kid. So Garfield's awesome, Tom Holland is awesome, but man, Tobey Maguire goes deep.
All
Hey,
right.
let me answer this really fast. I didn't bring ice cream. You were listening. Good for you. I didn't bring in resources, but the conference here in the church has gotten some for you. So one of the books that would fit this talk is a book I wrote. It's my most recent book. It's called Rebel's Manifesto. And you have that one in the back, right? All the books they got are good. Go check it out. It helps support the conference, etc. But Rebel's Manifesto, one of the first chapters is basically this talk. Ice cream versus insulin, clarifying truth. And I got the 25 most thorny ethical issues, whether it's things like gun control, immigration, transgenderism, the environment, you name it, and give principles to understand, but in particular to pass on to the next generation. So if this talk was helpful, there's actually two. There's a book by Lisa Childers, Live Your Truth, beautiful title, and then a Rebel's Manifesto would help follow up on this. After the break, we're going to come back and talk about, since truth sets us free, what is God's design for sexuality? And then that'll set us up as we get into the details of transgenderism and pornography.
Thanks, Sean. Let's give Sean a hand. Thank you for that.